Chapter 2. The Adaptation of Capital. According to Bernstein, the credit system, the improved ways of communication, and the new capitalist combines are the important factors that help the capitalist economy change and adapt. Credit is used in many ways in capitalism. Its two main jobs are to help production grow and to make trading easier. When the natural push for production to grow without limit meets the small size of private property, credit shows up as a way to overcome these limits in a very capitalist way. By using shareholding, credit puts many small amounts of money together into one big amount. This lets each capitalist use other people's money in the form of industrial credit. When used as commercial credit, it speeds up the trading of goods, which helps money return to production and supports the whole cycle of making products. It is clear how these two main functions of credit affect the creation of economic crises. If crises happen because production wants to grow while the market cannot buy all the goods, then credit is the very tool that makes this conflict happen as often as it can. First, credit makes production grow too much, pushing it to go beyond what the market can handle. But credit works in two ways. After it causes too much production, credit then stops working properly when a crisis begins. When the first signs of trouble appear, credit seems to melt away. It stops helping with trade, even in places where trade is still needed. Instead, where some trade continues, credit becomes weak and useless, lowering the market's ability to buy goods. Credit does more than just these two things. It also gives an entrepreneur a way to use other people's money. At the same time, it makes people use others' property in a bold and careless way, which leads to speculation. Credit makes crises worse not only by failing as a tool for trade, but also by changing trade into a very complicated and fake process. This new process depends on only a small amount of real money and can fall apart at the slightest problem. We see that credit, instead of being a tool to stop or lessen crises, is actually a very strong tool that creates them. It cannot be anything else. Credit removes the stiffness in capitalist relationships and makes everything very flexible. It makes all the forces in capitalism stretch out, depend on each other, and react strongly to each other. By doing this, credit makes crises happen more often and makes them worse, since these crises are just the regular clashes of the opposing forces in the capitalist economy. That brings us to another question. Why does credit seem to be a way for capitalism to adjust and survive? No matter how people describe this adjustment, it can only mean that credit has the power to weaken or remove one of the many conflicts within capitalism. This would then allow other forces in production to move more freely. But in reality, credit actually makes these conflicts much worse. It makes the struggle between production and trade even stronger by pushing production to its limits while shutting down trade at the smallest sign of trouble. It makes the conflict between production and ownership worse by separating the two, turning the capital used in production into social capital while turning part of the profit, interest on capital, into just a piece of paper showing ownership. It also increases the struggle between ownership and production by concentrating massive amounts of productive power in a few hands while pushing many small capitalists out. Finally, it makes the conflict between production as a social process and private capitalist ownership worse by forcing the government to step in and interfere with production. In short, credit doesn't solve the key conflicts in capitalism, it actually makes them stronger. It speeds up their development and pushes capitalism closer to its own downfall. If capitalism were really trying to adapt, it would need to break or even get rid of credit. But in reality, credit is not a tool that helps capitalism survive. It is actually one of the strongest forces driving it toward destruction. This revolutionary nature of credit has even inspired ideas for socialist reforms. Some people have supported these ideas, including figures like Isaac Pereira in France, whom Marx described as part prophet and part swindler. The second so-called solution to capitalism's problems, employers' organizations, is just as weak. Bernstein claims that these organizations will put an end to the chaos of production and stop economic crises by controlling how much gets produced. However, people haven't really thought through all the effects that come from the rise of industry groups and trusts. These business groups create a situation that can only be properly understood using Marxist ideas. One thing is clear, we could only say that capitalist organizations are stopping economic chaos if industrial monopolies, trusts, and similar groups actually became the main way production was run. But that can't happen because of how market leaders work. The main goal of these business groups is to control competition in a certain industry so they can control prices and increase their profits. By doing this, they make sure that more of the market's total profit goes to their industry instead of others. But this only works in certain industries, and if every industry tried to do the same thing, it would cancel itself out. Even within their limits, these business groups don't reduce chaos in the economy, they actually make it worse. Big companies often make more money in their home markets by selling their products at a higher price, but to keep production going, they sell extra products abroad for much cheaper. This means they are actually making competition in foreign markets even more intense instead of reducing it. The history of the global sugar industry is a clear example of this happening. Finally, capitalist groups make the problem worse between the worldwide economy and the nation's government because they always lead to a big tariff war that makes the differences between capitalist countries even sharper. We must also add that industry giants strongly push the concentration of production and speed up technical progress. In other words, when we look at their overall effect on the capitalist economy, industrial monopolies and trusts do not work as tools to help capitalism adjust. They do not lessen the deep conflicts of capitalism. Instead, they seem to cause more chaos. They help the inner conflicts of capitalism grow and make its overall decline come sooner. But if the credit system, corporations, and the rest do not stop capitalism's chaos, why have we not seen a major commercial crisis for 20 years since 1873? Does this mean that, unlike what Marx said, capitalism has changed to meet society's needs? No, because just after Bernstein rejected Marx's theory of crises in 1898, a deep general crisis broke out in 1900, and 7 years later a new crisis starting in the United States hit the world market. The facts showed that the idea of adaptation was false. They also showed that those who abandoned Marx's crisis theory because no crisis happened over a short time confused the true meaning of the theory with one of its less important parts, the idea of a 10-year cycle. For Marx and Engels, the 10-year cycle was only a simple statement of the facts in 1860 and 1870. It was not a natural law but was based on a series of historical events connected with the fast growth of young capitalism. The crisis of 1825 happened because a lot of money was spent on building roads, canals, and gas works during the previous decade, especially in England where the crisis started. The next crisis from 1836 to 1839 was also caused by heavy investment in transportation. The crisis of 1847 was brought about by the feverish building of railroads in England. In just 3 years, from 1844 to 1847, the British Parliament gave railway rights worth $15 billion. In each of these 3 cases, a crisis came after new foundations for capitalist development were built. In 1857, a similar result came when new markets for European industry suddenly opened in America and Australia after gold was found, and many railroads were built, especially in France, where they copied England's example. From 1852 to 1856, France built railway lines worth 1,250 million francs. And finally, there was the Great Crisis of 1873, a direct result of the strong boom in large industry in Germany and Austria that followed the political events of 1866 and 1871. So far, every commercial crisis was caused by the sudden growth of the capitalist economy, not by its shrinking. The fact that international crises happened every 10 years was just an outside occurrence, a matter of chance. The Marxist formula for crises, as explained by Engels in Anti-Düring and by Marx in the first and third volumes of Capital, applies to all crises only in that it shows their worldwide pattern and their basic causes. Crises might happen every 5 or 10 years, or even every 8 or 20 years. But the best proof that Bernstein's theory is wrong is that the most violent crisis, 1907 to 1908, occurred in the countries with the most developed means of adaptation, credit, advanced communications, and trusts. The idea that capitalist production can adapt to exchange assumes one of two things. Either the world market can grow without limits, or the growth of productive forces is so restricted that it cannot go beyond the market's limits. The first idea is physically impossible. The second is just as impossible because constant technical progress every day creates new productive forces in every area. There is still another event that, according to Bernstein, goes against the course of capitalist development as described above. In the study group of medium-sized businesses, Bernstein sees a sign that the growth of large industry is not moving in a revolutionary way and is not as effective in concentrating industry as the theory of collapse expected. However, he is mistaken here because he does not understand the process well. To think that large industry is slowly disappearing is to sadly misunderstand the nature of this process. Marxist theory says that owners of small businesses are like pioneers who bring new technology and new ways of making things into capitalism. They do this in two ways. First, they start new methods of production in industries that are already well established. Second, they help create entirely new industries that big companies have not yet taken over. It is wrong to think that the history of medium-sized business owners simply moves in a straight line toward disappearing. Instead, their growth goes up and down and is full of conflicts. These medium-sized business owners, like the workers, are caught between two opposing forces, one that pushes them upward and one that pushes them downward. In this case, the downward force is the constant growth in the scale of production, which sometimes becomes so large that it makes the average amount of capital too small to compete in the world market. The upward force works in two ways. One is that the value of the money or assets they already have goes down over time, which for a while reduces how much they can produce compared to the minimum money needed. This force also shows itself when capitalist production moves into new areas. The struggle between medium-sized businesses and big capital is not a simple battle where the weaker side just loses slowly. Instead, it happens in cycles where small businesses quickly grow up, only to be cut down again by large industry. These two forces take turns affecting medium-sized business owners, and in the end, the downward force wins. For the working class, the situation is quite different. The victory of the downward force does not always mean that the number of medium-sized businesses goes down. It shows up first by making the minimum amount of money needed to run businesses in old industries get higher and higher. It also shows up by shortening the time small business owners have to take advantage of new industries. For a small business owner, this means spending less time in a new industry and having to deal with faster changes in the ways of production where they invest. Overall, for the average group of business owners, there is a process of faster joining together and breaking apart over time. Bernstein understands this very well, and he even talks about it himself. But what he seems to forget is that this pattern is exactly how medium-sized businesses behave over time. If we agree that small business owners help bring new technology and improvements, and if these improvements are what keep capitalism alive, then it is clear that small business owners are a necessary part of capitalism. They will only disappear if capitalism itself disappears. Bernstein thinks that the disappearance of medium-sized businesses means that capitalism is heading toward a revolution. But in reality, it would mean the opposite. It would mean that capitalism is slowing down or even stopping. Marx explained that the rate of profit, or how fast capital grows, is especially important for new business owners trying to start on their own. If only a few big capitalists are the ones making all the investments, then the energy that keeps production going will fade away and eventually die out.